Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating deep dive into Islamic jurisprudence. We're looking at how religious law functions not just as a set of spiritual suggestions, but as an intricate, totally unchanging divine constitution. The material we're exploring today frames these ancient texts as a rigorous, fixed legal framework. Think of it as a massive system designed to measure the permissible, the halal, and the forbidden, the haram, using incredibly specific standards. It's honestly a captivating way to look at how daily logic and actions are structured for literally billions of people.
Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover 1. The Divine Constitution. 2. Defining pure and impure. 3. Slaughtering versus killing. 4. The rules of hunting. 5. People of the book. And 6. Measuring harm in drinks. Let's dive right in.
Section 1. The Divine Constitution. Let's establish the foundational premise of our source text.
What's super interesting right off the bat is how religion itself is defined here. The text views it not merely as a personal spiritual belief, but literally as the constitution of God. It's this comprehensive, overarching framework that governs 3 main areas: faith, worship, and transactions. These doctrinal standards are the origins of the jurisprudence. They're basically fixed tools, like scales and measuring tape, that do not change no matter what era we're in. Their entire purpose is to measure benefit versus harm, allowing believers to objectively determine what is halal and haram in literally any situation, from complex economics all the way down to what's sitting on your dinner plate.
That brings us to Section 2, Defining Pure and Impure. Let's look at exactly how this text categorizes the food we eat. So, the text relies on a mix of sensory and scientific logic to separate the acceptable from the forbidden. It breaks things down into 2 primary buckets: taiyab, which means pure or good, and khabith, meaning impure or harmful. Now, for something to be taiyab, it's got to have a good nature, feel, smell, color, and taste. On the flip side, khabith includes anything with an inherently harmful nature. This immediately rules out predatory animals like foxes or crows, animals that eat other animals or carcasses. It also applies to things like blood, which the framework explicitly categorizes as khabith because of its bad taste, its bad smell, and the simple fact that it carries harmful bacteria and microbes. Building on that logic, the text lays out a very strict, explicit list of forbidden foods. This includes blood, the flesh of swine, and anything dedicated to an entity other than Allah. But take a close look at the rest of this criteria: animals that are strangled, beaten to death, fallen from a height, or gored by horns. The text considers all of these to be dead and therefore haram. However, there is one major fascinating exception here. The source notes that if you manage to reach any of these injured animals while they are still alive and you slaughter them properly by mentioning the name of Allah, they actually become completely halal to eat.
Okay, now let's see how this builds into one of the most interesting regulations, the rule of jalala. Jalala refers to animals that are typically pure and good-natured, but for whatever reason, they've been feeding on impurities. Because that dirty diet actually changes the biological taste of their meat, milk, and eggs, eating them immediately is a no-go. Instead, these animals have to go through specific cleansing periods. It's basically a highly structured dietary detox: 40 days for camels, 30 days for cows, 7 for sheep, and 3 for chickens. It's a remarkably biological approach to ritual purity, right?
Moving right along to Section 3, Slaughtering versus Killing. This deals with a very profound theological distinction about taking an animal's life.
The core idea here is that life belongs to God, so destroying a body to extract that spirit is forbidden unless you have direct permission. Slaughtering requires mentioning Allah's name at the exact moment the neck is cut or the blood is shed. It's the act of invoking God's explicit permission to take that life, which is what makes the body halal. Killing, on the other hand, is removing the life by any means without mentioning Allah's name. Even if blood is shed perfectly, without that verbal permission from God, the animal is just considered a dead body, and eating it is strictly haram.
But, as with many legal frameworks, there is a specific caveat, the C exception. Fish and locusts are entirely exempt from the slaughtering rule. The source frames this as a literal divine mercy for humanity. I mean, think about it. It's practically impossible to know the exact moment a specific fish dies when you haul a massive net full of them out of the ocean. So, they are considered halal without ritual slaughter, provided their pure nature hasn't rotted or gone bad.
All right, let's step out of the slaughterhouse and into the wild with Section 4, the rules of hunting. The source outlines some highly procedural rules for legitimate hunting. To do it lawfully, you've got to follow these specific steps.
First, you use a trained hound or shoot an arrow. Second, and this is an absolute must, you have to mention Allah's name at the exact moment you release the hound or let that arrow fly. This establishes your intent. Finally, if the animal is killed by the sharp edge of your arrow or by your trained hound, you're good to eat it. Or if you run up to the prey and it's somehow still alive, you have to perform a standard ritual slaughter on the spot.
But wow, look at how strict the standard of proof is for these rules. The source lists several super specific invalidations to make sure the animal wasn't improperly killed. For example, if your arrow hits the animal with its flat middle instead of the sharp edge, it's considered beaten to death and it's haram. If you use an untrained hound and find the prey dead, haram. If another unknown dog joins your trained hunting dog, you can't eat the prey because you have no idea which dog actually made the kill. And if you shoot an animal, lose sight of it, and later find it drowned in a river, it's forbidden because the water might have killed it, not your arrow. The burden of proof is intense.
Which brings us to Section 5, People of the Book. This introduces the text's most complex and strict framework regarding societal interactions.
Now, to understand the arguments the source is making here, we really have to look at its critical interpretive framework. The text basically divides scriptural verses into two categories. First, you have ruling verses. These contain precise orders and absolute judgments. They form the unchanging bedrock of the law. Second, you have curriculum verses. These are described as verses of news or historical situations. They report on events and are entirely reliant on their specific context, meaning they don't function as permanent legal orders on their own.
The source applies this exact framework directly to this famous quote regarding the people of the book, meaning Jews and Christians. The text argues that this is not a ruling verse, but rather a news verse. According to their interpretation, this verse applied specifically to the historical 23-year era when the Quran was actively being revealed and people of previous scriptures were actively converting to Islam. The source states that God was simply declaring that the food and the women of these new converts were now lawful because they had entered the faith.
Based on that specific reading, the text arrives at a very strict theological conclusion for modern times, which it calls the era of the Quran. The source asserts that the eras of the Torah and the Gospel have passed, and today all people on earth are technically people of the Quran. Therefore, relying heavily on specific ruling verses that forbid marrying polytheists or non-believers, this legal framework absolutely forbids interfaith marriages today. It categorizes such alliances as forbidden, arguing that believers must only marry believers.
All right, let's move to our final section, Section 6, Measuring Harm in Drinks. Here we'll analyze the logical framework for prohibiting alcohol and measuring future substances.
To explain its rule for measuring harm, the framework points to this specific quote about wine and gambling. The verse actually acknowledges that there might be some minor benefit to these things, but the sin, or the harm, is far, far greater. The text argues that this sets a fixed standard. It's basically a mathematical formula for the future. Anything where the harm outweighs the benefit is categorically forbidden. This provides the ultimate standard to measure and prohibit future drugs, modern intoxicants, or new synthetic beverages that didn't even exist when the text was originally written.
Finally, the framework uses this logic to push back against a really common historical idea. A lot of people believe that alcohol was prohibited gradually in Islam, often pointing to a verse that tells believers not to approach prayer while intoxicated. However, this specific interpretation argues that the laws of the Constitution are absolute. It asserts that this verse was never a stepping stone in a gradual prohibition. It was merely a specific condition for purity before worship, kind of like washing your hands. The outright prohibition of alcohol, based purely on its harm, remains a totally separate and absolute ruling.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive. It leaves us with a truly fascinating question to chew on. Does framing ancient religious texts as an unchanging legal constitution, with strict rules of evidence, intent, and measurable harm, change the way we understand the daily logic and actions of billions of people today? It certainly reframes religion from a mere set of spiritual beliefs into a highly structured, operational system of living. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the frameworks around you, and I'll see you next time.